All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this series again, the 10 stages of supply chain technology maturity. I'm a resident CEO and founder of Throughput. Today, I am joined again by our chief data scientist, uh, Anzar Kamdar, and we're excited to walk you through the first journey stage, which involves taking and working with spreadsheets. So, very interesting series. If you have not been following yet, the entire premise is that yes, there is a certain framework that's been taught in the last 60 to 70 years about how to approach supply chain problems. And what we're doing is we're taking sort of a different approach where we're saying, hey, let's build up from like how do we get to where we are today, right? Whether we are still operating our tally books in the field or in maintenance or operations, maybe we're keeping it all in our head, right? Are we using spreadsheets? Do we have an ERP, WMS, MES, ontology layers? All of that's going to be covered in this series. So for today, what I had in mind was just to walk through the first stage, right, where many people hit, you know, inadvertently thinking about, hey, how do I bring some more standardization to how I'm tracking things so it's not in my head, and so we can have version control across a lot of different operations, right? And that is typically the spreadsheet. So the pros, the cons, the limitations, that's what we're going to cover in this call today. And hopefully, if you have any questions, please leave in the comments and we will address it during the call or maybe later. So I'd like to maybe just start out with, I don't want to keep it busy, but I just want to maybe just lay the road. Is the analogy or the story that we're making is, hey, say you're on the highway or even learning how to drive, right? Like where do we start if you think about this journey, right? Is is basically we consider this like being on the lease road, right? Which is, hey, you don't really have to join the highway, but you can stay on the lease road. It's probably going to get you somewhere, but it's probably not going to get you anywhere faster. So we're going to talk about primarily the situation, then talk about customer anecdotes. So there's at least 90% of companies that when we meet end up being in this space before they mature to whatever they end up maturing to, whether it's BI or ERP, and then also how to get back to the highway, right? And then the consequences of staying on the path, which I think is also important, and maybe some of the technology culprits, which won't be as important on this call and office hours, but maybe later. So with that, maybe let's talk about the situation. So Unzer, talk to me about spreadsheets, right? How did we get to spreadsheets? What are the pros, the cons, the limitations?
The spreadsheets are like the Swiss Army knife in modern life, right? All of us get taught how to use Excel in fifth grade. They're very flexible. There's some things that they're very good at. There's some things that they're not good at. And depending on the scale and size of both your data and the organization and the operation itself, those things change. Uh, why we actually end up with spreadsheets, we start with spreadsheets, we end up with spreadsheets. This is stage one. Uh, as I mentioned previously in our last session, anytime we have any sort of operation, we're saying, warehousing or some sort of manufacturing, you're starting with whiteboards as maybe your most rudimentary form of data and collection and performance tracking. Spreadsheets come into the picture when you need to, let's say, there's two reasons. You could say that you're data driven all of a sudden. You have to understand what's happening with your operation, so you start collecting the data, so it becomes your system of record almost. I'm not saying it's the best for that, but these are some of the reasons people get pulled towards spreadsheet. Um, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? You're also able to do some fancy optimization, simulation. There's a lot of things that you could do, different formulas. Uh, but it's mostly the ease of use, familiarity, and the flexibility that sometimes you're constrained by in your modern systems. It's just a very familiar friend to turn to.
Yeah, and speaking of which, right? So coming through with my own career, I remember I got my little blue tally book when I was in the field, and I was going around measuring totes and looking at numbers and all that, right? So that was just me, obviously taking care of my job responsibility. But then because we used to work across shifts, obviously I couldn't just hand a tally book to the next person and say, "Hey, you guys read my scribbles if you can read what I wrote." So to your point, right? The most obvious tool that we could use at the time was a spreadsheet. So how we would communicate how much chemicals would be left would be through an Excel sheet that we were as a tracker for the most part. And it worked, right? Which is, hey, the next engineer on shift could quickly go through it. We could communicate over the internet, right? Me sitting in like say the hotel and say, hey, no, that's actually a 10, that's not a 100. And so it brought a lot of flexibility. On top of that, we could also use the same spreadsheet to communicate back to procurement to say, hey, we're all just sort of using this to manage our day-to-day inventory. Where I think the challenges came to be, and maybe we'll talk about it on journey stage 2, is when we would have to do double entry, right? So which is essentially what I mean by that is implemented or put the information that I have in the field into a system like SAP. So talk to me about that, right? Because I think this duplicacy of work, right, is often the thing that prevents people from going beyond the lease road, right? Why do you think that is, and will that always be the case?
So this happens both ways, as you mentioned, right? Like you first record on Excel, and then maybe you have to enter it into SAP. At the same time, I've seen people pull data from ERP systems back into Excel so they can manipulate and work with the data. I don't foresee that changing anytime soon. There are promises that now, with a AI agent or a copilot, they'll do the calculations for you, and all you have to do is chat with them. I mean, that's just a simple reality. There's always going to be redundancy based on how those systems are built, and Excel is always the easy eject button to get that information back under your control.
Yeah, I mean, version control is the biggest thing, right? So let's speak about maybe our customers, right? So right now in the US at least, there's this big focus with some of the large organizations that, oh, they're operating on spreadsheets. Look at them, they're 60 years old. That's so bad, right? Oh, we got to create a single source of truth. Speak to me on that, right? Which is why have these spreadsheets suddenly have why do they have these like why does there's like this negative feeling towards these spreadsheets? And how is the next journey stage, which is often, hey, like let's put it all in one single source of truth. Why don't we get an ERP? Not the solution.
So, what I would say is that we need to look at it from the perspective of what are you giving up as you move towards, let's say, a spreadsheet? Are you using your spreadsheet as your entire operating system? So, let's say you go from those whiteboards where everyone has that information available, like these are the amount of defects in the shift, this is the amount of inventory, this is what's coming, that everyone can look at. All of a sudden, once you start tracking that in an Excel sheet, you're moving that back and forth. Who owns the responsibility for that Excel sheet? You talked about version control. We've all seen V2 final, real final, final, that's what happens with Excel sheets. But at the same time, they are a useful tool because right now there's like a lot of, let's say, press against that. Like, hey, I came into this organization and it's being run on Excel, but it's running quite good. Yet I want something shiny because this just makes us look backwards. Now, what Excel is not good at is, as you know, depending on the limit, you should not be using it as your database. All of a sudden, there's different version control issues. Of course, you can manage that if you're, using some sort of cloud software, but all of a sudden, that common operating picture starts to get fuzzy as someone starts to take control of that Excel sheet. Someone has that responsibility over that Excel sheet, and other people need to make decisions. Has it been updated? And that's one of the biggest problems with, let's say, Excel sheets, right? They don't capture the dynamics of your operations because the moment that you put the data in there, it's already stale. You took it at that exact moment in time. That's why you see people pushing towards ERP because all of a sudden anything that's getting scanned in a warehouse at least is somewhat updated.
Yeah, to that point, let's speak to some customer examples, right? So I already spoke to like one large organization. Obviously, there's a big boom happening right now in the AI space. So why shouldn't a company not just hire someone with 35 years of domain expertise in their industry, you know, create that master spreadsheet they did back at, I don't know, pick Boeing, for example, and then just bring that over and say, hey, like we can use it here and we can scale from here. And this is how we're going to get from, I don't know, from 60 million in revenue all the way to a billion in revenue over the next 5, 10 years.
Now we're talking about something different, which is spreadsheet modeling, modeling systems with spreadsheets. Again, maybe at the size of the company that you're in, that's okay. But again, all of a sudden, the person that you hired that's responsible for keeping this model up to date, updating the parameters, it all of a sudden becomes a, let's say, a hero ball moment for that person. And it's fantastic if they're able to deliver constantly, but as the dynamics and the environment changes constantly, as you're speaking with your customers, as things keep changing, who's expected to keep updating those numbers? Who's expected to keep rerunning those models? As I mentioned, Excel is not very good at capturing the dynamics and cause and effect in supply chains. Um, Caveat there is that people do, some modeling and simulation on dynamics of supply chains, but that's still not real data. We're talking about actual data that you're acting upon. And that's just the natural progression to why people gravitate towards databases in the next step. Again, from my perspective, you're always losing something as you jump into the next technology without updating your processes. And you need to always be aware of the workflow as well as the actual what you're gaining and what you're losing and what needs to be updated in your physical reality of your operations.
Yeah. So for me, I think the big thing it does is obviously it creates a single point of failure, right? And
Yeah.
the next thing obviously is without that person, to your point, with the domain expertise, would the business run? And that typically brings us to, hey, if we standardize it and decentralize it to a point where other people can also manage and understand it, that actually becomes a little bit of a de-risking strategy for the business. So let's talk about that as well, right? At the Excel sheet level, you make certain decisions around what the columns and rows mean. I mean, we can call it data dictionaries if you want. We make certain recommendations around what columns to map, etc. Talk to me about the logic layer, the consequences of building all the logic on an Excel sheet. Obviously, as an engineer, the first thing I did when I discovered macros was I just went in there and started, putting all sorts of code in and out. You spoke to optimization. A lot of people use it for goal seek and other things, right? So, what are the what is the like? I mean, obviously once you bake the cake, that's it. But what are your from your perspective the concerns about doing that, right? And what are the consequences?
Yeah, I mean, have you ever debugged an Excel sheet? I'm not talking about debugging code that you wrote yourself, but we're talking about debugging even your own Excel sheet or worse yet, someone else's Excel sheet. You have to find these vague formulas and understand how it works. We've seen it with our customers. You have to fact check those assumptions. If you make a mistake at the early stage, because there are limitations to Excel as far as the amount of power it has. It does have that flexibility, but when we're talking about doing these, simulations or optimizations or these small models that we do in Excel to drive our decisions, uh, we have to be very careful in what we're modeling. And all models are wrong, even the fanciest ones powered by a lot of GPU compute behind them. But with Excel, all of a sudden, it just becomes very problematic. As I mentioned, it becomes a hero ball moment. Uh, who generated this Excel? Who's responsible for it? And there are people that are able to firefight through that and actually keep organizations running. That's the reality of it. There are organizations running on the backbone of an Excel hero. I think we'll talk about stage 10 later, where you're able to actually take some of the advantages of Excel and how it's so deeply embedded into workflows and overcome these limitations by actually what we mentioned as far as synchronizing the data, keeping it fresh, keeping it in real time without forcing people to, let's say, adopt a complete new workflow.
So speak to me on the data side as well. I mean, how do you ensure that cleanliness of data occurs at this stage, right? That's another thing. Obviously, you can put in system checkers and say, okay, well, that number looks wrong, etc. But um, some companies are going to be on the lease road forever. Like today, 90% of companies are on that lease road, right? Even if though they're exploring ERP or whatever they're doing. So how do you build in the data checks early, right? If you do decide to stay on the lease road, I know certain people, they won't take three right turns because they don't want to take a left turn. There are people like that, and I totally understand, respect that. But like, how do you, even if you're operating with an Excel sheet, have that level of discipline? So, like for me, again, as I said, for me, the Excel sheet is not an enemy. I would rather prefer 100 clean Excel sheets where the data is so meticulously checked than a super system where it's about 50% garbage, right? So speak to me on that, right? And I think that'll help us sort of transition in the next few episodes to the other stages. What would you prefer?
I mean, you're talking about quality checking the data in an Excel sheet. I actually had a consultant ask me if I could build them an LLM to fact check a 73 row Excel sheet. So it's not some work that anyone wants to do. It's quite frustrating. Um, but at the same time, it's not just about the quality of the data and fat finger errors. It's also about the operational definitions. Like, what does this row column mean? What you wrote here, what does it mean? It has to tie back to the physical operations. And if you're doing it yourself, depending on your level of domain expertise, it could be very, very good. But of course, there's two aspects, right? There's the, let's say, human errors that you could make, that anyone can make a mistake. But then there's those assumptions that get built into what those rows and columns mean that may wildly differ. And it's not limited to Excel. It's also in the next stage when we talk about ERPs. If you've ever opened up, what any organization's ERP looks like, there's all these ZZ columns that are just completely custom. And Excel is at least flexible from that perspective because it's very easy to add your own columns and specific, KPIs and constraints. But if we're talking about standardizing Excel sheets, you first have to have standard operational definitions and understand that what you're putting in those rows and cells is actually reflecting the reality.
Yeah, to your point, right? If you make certain decisions, and regardless of what system you choose, we're just picking on Excel right now because this is the first episode. The decisions you make defining what those columns and rows mean now will have consequences. I've seen this myself, where in a maintenance organization, they decide to call the demand signal the mean time between failure, and obviously, I don't look at it the same way, but because they treat demand from that perspective, and nobody really went and checked that assumption until much later, specifically us. We personally believe it costs billions of dollars of unnecessary orders because the column that they're mapping the signal to is a reaction time window, in my opinion, than the actual demand window. So, Andrew, do you have examples like that on your side? I mean, that's the most critical one I've seen scale up from like a spreadsheet where obviously people don't agree on lead times and does lead time mean and what does supply and demand, what the constraint means, etc. But to your point, why is Excel really bad at sort of crystallizing or capturing that?
What we think might be bad might actually be an advantage for certain people. People like to change the parameters in specific cells. Let's talk about from a cost modeling perspective. I ran into this example in the construction industry where I couldn't believe the numbers we were being quoted for reinforced concrete columns because someone just made a simple mistake in the parameters because they lacked the domain expertise and they Googled the answer, which returned them, the answer in a different currency with a 3-to-1 exchange rate. So again, there's an advantage to Excel in the sense that you could just go fix the parameters and you're happy. But as you mentioned, the demand signal, the choice of those objective functions that we talk about, whether it's in Excel or whether it's in optimization models or whether it's in AI, uh, the lack of standardization around that, and it's a deeper problem because it comes from your organizational issues as far as optimizing for local silos. Excel just becomes like an easy scapegoat simply because the person creating the Excel sheet, unless it's an agent, is usually one person. And it is their own little fiefdom. That Excel sheet itself is their own little fiefdom.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised in very, very large organizations. There's probably one person, 35 years of experience, who's basically holding the entire supply chain on that Excel sheet. But to your point, right? The goal here is not to pick on spreadsheets,
Yep.
but it's more to offer a solution to say, okay, well, spreadsheets have their advantages as we spoke about. There's also limitations, but how do you get to your final destination faster, right? Because yeah, you can stay on the lease road and get to where you're going, but how do we get people back on a throughput highway, right? So in the next few lectures, we're just going to show you how you can evolve even as a driver to look at how to get to that end goal faster. For us, the objective is to fulfill more demand faster. Maybe for you, it might be something else, might maybe readiness, it might be more profit, but a generic denominator that we seem to see across all industries seems to be that. So, Azra, I know a lot of people just complain, right, and say, "Hey, there's a problem, there's this, there's that." That's sort of the issue in our industry. I would say it's just like, "Oh, this is the problem, but what is the solution?" Right? So obviously, we can't provide the full solution, but how can we help you get back to the throughput highway just from where we're sitting?
So People like to scapegoat Excel as the enemy. I wouldn't say it is. It's always going to be very useful for quick prototyping, quick modeling, quick checking of assumptions and calculations, that it gives that flexibility and the power back to the operator when they're confined to very strict systems. And we're going to get to that as well, like what you're giving up as you move away from Excel. But getting people on the on ramp, you're on the lease road right now. I think what you need to learn to first do is look left and right. You can't just be driving tunnel vision just in your lane. You have to look left and right, and that's what there's a risk of when you're just stuck with specific technologies that are optimizing in silos, Excel or otherwise.
And to that point, right? So when we began this series last week, we talked about the 10 stages, right? And I think this is a good segue into talking about other technologies that are out there. So what we sort of discovered is whether you like it or not, for the most part, if you're on the Excel to hey ERP to whatever next journey, you're gonna have to go through these steps. But to your point, there is a way to get there faster, right? So talk to me on the side of augmentation technologies for an Excel, right? For most people, they think the next step is like, hey, what's out there? And the first thing they'll discover is an ERP. And then I would say they're stuck on that off ramp or on ramp,
Yep.
the way you look at it. But speak to me about, Excel is always going to be a universal tool. And what's easy about it is so many people can learn it. It's
Yep.
really hard to get people to learn a new system, right? To
Yep.
your point earlier on, even some of our more sophisticated customers, they'll have that throughput dashboard where they're looking at inventory rebalancing and everything, but then they sort of default back to the Excel sheet or something that they can allow for columns to have version control. Just so speak to me about like maybe just bypassing the next 9 or 10 stages, right? What solutions exist today if your company, and again, this comes to aptitude limitations as well. Not everybody's going to be a data scientist, as you know, right? But if the company wants to continue working on Excel, which I believe 90% of companies will do, right? Even if they get an ERP system to track the invoices and have a little bit more financial control for the CFO, the operating system is still going to be Excel for 90% of the companies, whether you like it or not, whether all of the people that are using it are engineers or not, right? So what's out there under, like, what technologies have you seen to say, okay, I have an Excel sheet. Obviously, this is not scalable. I have to manage supplier lead times. I look at demand forecasts. That information doesn't live in my Excel sheet. That lives in someone else's Excel sheet. But I need to bring it together in terms of an interim system, an operating system, so I can actually meet my throughput goals.
I had a colleague that was tasked by a Fortune 500 to take 100 Excel sheets from different departments with different directors, try to consolidate it all into a SQL database and write it out again to an Excel sheet that they could all look at synchronized. Um, Again, that sounds silly, but it actually has a decent use case behind it to be able to synchronize that data. Uh, as you mentioned, Excel is actually where the real work lies. Regardless of what sort of technologies are being pitched, it is probably the most deeply embedded in operational workflows in all parts of the supply chain. Our technology, for example, both takes Excel as an input and an output, CSVs, Excels. And the reality is that even with the next stage when we start talking about huge ERP, MES, TMS systems, there's the real work is not completely captured in those systems. It's often you have to supplement it with what's being recorded on Excel, emails, WhatsApp, phone call, things like this. And from that perspective, there's a technology that we're going to talk about in stage 10 that actually helps take these Excel workflows that are deeply dear to the planners and buyers, and instead of treating them as people without brains, you recognize that they're able to use those Excel sheets to make very flexible decisions, flexible, creative decisions. And the idea of being able to synchronize those Excel sheets is quite powerful, I would say. And we know a technology like that.
Yeah, maybe check it out. DC out of Dallas. But again, to Andrew's point, right? We're talking about stage 10. What I want to emphasize, it could be stage 1.5 right now.
Yeah.
Right between what you're cleaning your data and you realizing that hey, spreadsheets, I have my spreadsheet strategy game down. What do I do next, right? So, um, the point of this is right. Everybody's trying to get to that destination, and for us, I feel some organizations have sort of divvied up the path and they're sort of figuring out how to get back to it. But I do want to emphasize, right? Even if you're operating in spreadsheets today, you can bypass hundreds of millions of dollars of investments for really large organizations, or even like all of these systems, and get to stage 10 tomorrow if you choose to, right? But what we've seen with organizations over the last 10 years is they sort of like trial and error their way to doing this. I'm seeing a major AI chip player doing this right now in their supply chain operations, right, where they're just like building models, doing closed loop, open loop, comparing it. And we're just sitting there looking and saying, well, this is stuff that we did in 2018, 2019 with the budget of a seed round, right? Why wouldn't you just skip ahead? So maybe under speak to that, right? Why wouldn't you just skip ahead to try these technologies that can augment Excel today, synchronize your lead times? I haven't gone to stage 9 either, but you could probably go into stage 9. There's other things out there such as consulting groups that can help you focus on the organization constraint, consulting groups that can help you segment how you look at demand. Why is more effort or interest not being diverted in that direction versus the typical path, right, which we all know leads to years and years of digital transformation implementation?
I think I have a simple answer, but it's just a theory. Most companies and frameworks right now wouldn't even be discussing the stage one around Excel. It's just a dirty little secret in most organizations. People don't want to talk about it. We're already pitching connected enterprises and integrated enterprises and things like this, and that's like further down the line. It's and most people think that you can't even run any sort of operation or business or supply chain without those technologies.
Yeah, exactly. So hopefully this has been useful to you all, right? So I mean, maybe